They thought it would take 10 minutes. They were wrong. On the hottest day of 1957, 12 strangers locked themselves in a room to decide if a 19-year-old boy deserved to die. The funny thing about certainty is that it feels exactly the same whether you're right or dead wrong. Among the 12, only one man understood something the others didn't. Probability isn't the same as certainty, and that difference between the two is as narrow as a knife blade, and that is where the whole picture can change.
The thing about murder, the old man thought as he watched the others file into the jury room, is that it's the only crime where the defendant and the victim can't both be telling the truth. His name was McCardle, though none of them knew that yet, wouldn't know it until much later, if at all, and he was 70 years old with a heart condition that made his chest feel like someone had parked a Buick on it whenever he got excited. He had a bottle of little white pills in his jacket pocket that he'd already reached for twice during the trial, and he had a feeling he'd be reaching for them again before this day was through. The jury room was on the second floor of the courthouse, a long, narrow space with windows that looked out over the city. It was the hottest day of the year, June something, 1957, though the heat made it feel like August, and the room smelled of old wood, floor wax, and the ghost of 1,000 stale cigarettes. There was a long table scarred with the initials and idle scratches of God knows how many previous jurors, 12 chairs around it, and not much else. A water cooler gurgled in one corner like a dying man trying to speak. A coat rack stood by the door to the bathroom like a skeleton at a funeral. The foreman, a small, officious man who coached high school football and had the mentality to match, was already tearing up little slips of paper for the first ballot. He did this with the concentrated fury of a man who believes that activity equals importance, his thick fingers working the paper like he was defusing a bomb instead of preparing for a vote that everyone knew would take about 5 minutes.
11-1 for guilty. That's what McCardle figured it would be. Maybe 12-0. The boy had killed his father, after all. Everyone knew it. The evidence was there, clear as day, stacked up like cordwood. The old man downstairs who'd heard the shouting, the woman across the street who'd seen it happen through the windows of a passing elevated train, the knife, that peculiar knife with its carved handle, the kind you didn't see every day. Open and shut, as they say. Except there was something about the whole thing that bothered McCardle, had been bothering him all through the trial, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. A feeling, like when you're walking through your house at night and you know something's out of place, but you can't see what it is in the darkness. The boy sitting there at the defense table, 19 years old, his face blank as a wall, his eyes empty as rooms in a house where nobody lives anymore. The lawyer who'd barely put up a fight, going through the motions like a man sleepwalking through someone else's dream.
And the simple fact that they were about to send a human being to the electric chair based on the testimony of people who might, just might, be wrong. "Okay, gentlemen," the foreman said, his voice carrying that forced cheerfulness of someone who desperately wants to be liked. "Everybody's here. Let's get started. What do you say?" The guard pulled the door closed. There was a soft click as the lock engaged, and that sound, that simple, final click, changed everything. They were locked in now. 12 men in a room, and somewhere out there a 19-year-old boy waited to find out if he was going to live or die. McCardle found his seat, number 9, which seemed appropriate for a man in the 9th inning of his life, and watched the others settle in. There was a young man, couldn't be more than 25, a mechanic by the look of his hands, taking the seat next to him. Across the table, a stockbroker in an expensive suit was already reading his newspaper, probably checking to see how his investments had done while he'd been wasting time on jury duty. Next to him, a man who looked like he sold something, insurance maybe, or shoes, was loosening his tie and checking his watch. They all had somewhere else to be. Lives waiting for them outside this room. The salesman had tickets to a ball game. The stockbroker had money to make. The mechanic probably had a girl waiting somewhere, young and pretty and full of life. And here they sat, 12 strangers, about to decide if a boy they'd never met before this week deserved to die. "All right," the foreman said, standing at the head of the table like a captain on a ship that wasn't going anywhere. "I figure we can handle this any way we want. We can discuss it first and then vote, or we can vote right away and see where we stand. What do you think?"
"Let's vote," someone said. The big man, number 3, who'd spent the entire trial glaring at the defendant like the kid had personally wronged him somehow. "We all know he's guilty. Let's just get this over with." "Yeah," the salesman agreed, number 7, still looking at his watch. "Let's vote and get out of here. I got places to be." The foreman looked around the table. Nobody objected. Why would they? It was hot, they were tired, and the case was obvious. Kid killed his old man, end of story. "Okay then," the foreman said. "This has to be unanimous. You all know that. 12-0, either way. And if we vote guilty, the judge gives him the chair. There's no recommendation for mercy in a case like this. It's mandatory." The room got quiet. Even the salesman stopped fidgeting with his watch. "All those voting guilty," the foreman said, "raise your hands." Hands went up around the table. 1, 2, 5, 8, 10. McCardle watched them rise like a slow wave, and he felt his own hands starting to lift, felt the weight of the obvious pulling at his arm. 11 hands in the air. Everyone looked around, counting, making sure. 11. One hand still down. McCardle turned his head, following the other's gaze, and saw who it was. Number 8, the architect. A quiet man, maybe 42, who'd sat through the entire trial with a thoughtful expression, like he was watching something unfold that only he could see. He sat there now, his hands folded on the table in front of him, his face calm as a priest at confession. "You voted not guilty?" the foreman asked, and there was something in his voice, not anger yet, but the seed of it, the way you can hear thunder coming before the storm arrives. The architect nodded. "That's right." "You think he's innocent?" "I don't know," the architect said, his voice quiet but firm. "That's the problem." The big man, number 3, made a sound like a bull that's just spotted a matador. "What do you mean you don't know? You heard the same trial we did. You heard the witnesses, you saw the evidence." "I did," the architect agreed, "and I have a reasonable doubt." "Reasonable doubt?" Number 7, the salesman, laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The old man heard him threaten to kill his father. The woman across the street saw him do it. They found the kid's knife in the old man's chest. What more do you need? An instant replay?" The architect didn't rise to the bait. He just sat there, patient as stone, and said, "I'd like to talk about it." "Talk about what?" Number 3 was half out of his seat now. "There's nothing to talk about." "Then it shouldn't take very long," the architect said. And just like that, the temperature in the room seemed to rise 10 degrees. McCardle reached into his jacket and pulled out his bottle of pills. His chest was starting to hurt, that old familiar pressure, like God's own hand pressing down on his sternum. He slipped one of the tiny white tablets under his tongue and waited for it to dissolve, waited for the relief that might or might not come. Outside, through the windows, the city baked in the afternoon heat. Car horns bleated in the distance. Somewhere, someone was living their life, going about their business, unaware that in this room, 12 strangers were about to go to war over the life of a boy they barely knew. The architect looked around the table, meeting each man's eyes in turn, and McCardle saw something in his face that he recognized because he'd felt it himself during the trial. Doubt. Not certainty, not righteousness, just doubt. And doubt, McCardle knew from his 70 years of living, was the most dangerous thing in the world. "All right," the foreman said, trying to maintain control, trying to be the captain of this sinking ship.
If you want to talk, we'll talk, but I think we ought to go in order. Everybody gets a turn. Fair? Fair, the architect agreed. Number 2, a meek little bank clerk who looked like he apologized for breathing, cleared his throat. Well, he said, I guess I think he's guilty. I mean, somebody proved it, didn't they? I didn't hear anyone prove he wasn't guilty. The architect leaned forward slightly. Nobody has to prove he's not guilty, he said, his voice still patient, still calm. The burden of proof is on the prosecution. That's in the Constitution. Number 2 blushed and looked down at his hands. What he means, Number 4 said, the stockbroker smoothing his tie like he was smoothing his thoughts, is that the evidence speaks for itself. The facts are clear. Let's stick to the facts. Let's, the architect agreed. The old man who lived downstairs, he said he heard the boy shout, I'm going to kill you, and then he heard a body fall. A split second later, he ran to his door and saw the boy running down the stairs. Is that right? That's right. Number 3 growled. What about it? The woman across the street, the architect continued. She testified that she looked out her window and saw the boy stab his father through the windows of a passing elevated train, correct? Correct, Number 4 said. And she identified him positively in court. She picked his voice out of 5 others blindfolded. And the knife, the architect said. The boy bought a knife that evening, a switchblade with a very unusual handle. The storekeeper identified it. The boy's friends saw him with it, and that same knife was found in the father's chest. Now you're talking sense, Number 7 said, grinning. So what's the problem? The architect was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something that made half the men at the table lean forward to see. It was a knife, a switchblade, with a carved handle, exactly like the murder weapon. I bought this last night at a pawn shop 2 blocks from the boy's apartment. It cost me $2. He pressed the button, and the blade snicked out, gleaming in the afternoon light. If I could find one, maybe someone else could too. The room exploded. Later, much later, when McCardle was an old man waiting to die in a place that smelled of disinfectant and boiled vegetables, he would remember this moment. The way the room seemed to tilt sideways like the world had just shifted on its axis. The way Number 3's face went from red to purple, the color of a heart attack waiting to happen. The architect sat there, calm as Sunday morning, that knife gleaming on the table in front of him like an accusation. What the hell is this? Number 3 roared, lunging forward. The foreman in Number 12 grabbed him, held him back, but he was strong. You could see it in the muscles of his shoulders, the cords standing out in his neck. You can't pull some stunt like this. It's not a stunt, the architect said. His voice was still quiet, but there was steel underneath it now, the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout. It's a fact. That knife isn't as unique as we thought. Number 4 picked up the knife, examined it with the detached interest of a man used to evaluating investments. Even if there are 10 knives like this, or 100, it's still a remarkable coincidence that someone else would have used one to kill the boy's father on the same night the boy bought one. Remarkable, the architect agreed, but possible. Possible, Number 7 laughed, harsh and ugly. You know what else is possible? That I'll win the Irish sweepstakes and retire to Florida. Doesn't mean it's going to happen. But something had changed in the room. McCardle could feel it, the way you can feel a storm building even when the sky is still clear. The doubt was spreading, invisible as smoke, getting into everything. Number 5, the young mechanic, leaned forward, looking at the knife. There was something in his eyes, something haunted. "I seen knife fights," he said quietly. Nobody had asked, but he said it anyway. "Where I come from, you see 'em. Switchblades come with the neighborhood." "So what?" Number 10, a garage owner with a perpetual cold and an ugly view of the world, blew his nose into a handkerchief that had seen better days. What's that got to do with anything? The way you use a switchblade, Number 5 said, and now he was standing, reaching for the knife. He held it in his hand, closed it, then opened it again with a flick of his wrist. You don't use it overhand, you come up from underneath, like this. He demonstrated, a swift upward thrust that made Number 2 flinch. Anyone who's ever used a switchblade knows that, Number 5 said. It's how they're made. And this kid, he'd been fighting with knives since he was old enough to hold one. Reform school for stabbing somebody when he was 15. You telling me he'd suddenly forget everything he knew and stab his father the wrong way? The wrong way, Number 3 repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Listen to this. Now we got an expert on stabbing. I know what I seen, Number 5 said, and there was steel in his voice too now, the steel of a man who'd grown up hard and survived it. I know how those things work, and I'm telling you, that kid wouldn't have stabbed his father overhand, not with his experience. He'd go for him low and fast, the way you have to. Number 3 started to respond, but the architect held up his hand. Let's talk about the old man, he said, the one who lived downstairs. He said he heard the boy shout, I'm going to kill you, and then he heard the body hit the floor, and then, a split second later, he was at his front door watching the boy run down the stairs. That's what he said, Number 4 confirmed. What about it? The architect is directly below the one where the killing took place. Same layout. I'd like to see the diagram again. The foreman, looking confused and slightly irritated at having lost control of the proceedings, knocked on the door. The guard brought in the diagram, a large pen and ink drawing of the apartment layout. The architect spread it out on the table. Here's the bedroom where the old man was sleeping, and here's the front door. He had to get out of bed, walk 12 feet to the bedroom door, open it, walk 43 feet down the hall, and open the front door, all in 15 seconds. So he ran. So what? He's 75 years old, the architect said. He had a stroke last year. He drags his left leg when he walks. They had to help him into the witness chair. Oh, for Christ's sake, Number 7 muttered, but there was less certainty in his voice now. I want to try something, the architect said. He stood up, walked to the far end of the room. Someone time me. And just like that, they were all standing, watching as the architect paced off the distance and then walked it at the speed an old man might manage, dragging one leg slightly, his face set in concentration. It took him 41 seconds. The room was silent. But he said 15 seconds, Number 2 said, his voice small. He was wrong, the architect said, or he was lying, or he wanted so badly to be important, to be listened to for once in his invisible life, that he convinced himself he'd seen something he hadn't. McCardle felt something shift in his chest, and it wasn't his heart condition. It was something else. Recognition, maybe. He'd seen that old man on the witness stand, seen the way he'd sat up straight, the way his voice had gotten stronger when the lawyers asked him questions. A man who'd been nothing all his life, suddenly the center of attention, suddenly important. How hard would it be to convince yourself you'd heard something, seen something, when the alternative was going back to being nobody? This is ridiculous, Number 3 said, but there was something desperate in his voice now. You're twisting everything around. You're making us doubt what we know to be true. What do we know to be true? The architect asked. Really know. The woman, Number 4 said firmly, the woman across the street saw it happen. She looked out her window at the exact moment of the murder, and she saw the boy stab his father. She testified to it. She was certain. Through the windows of a moving elevated train, the architect said. The lights were out in the train, Number 4 countered. They proved in court that you can see through the windows of an L train when the lights are out. That's right, Number 3 said. They proved it. The architect nodded slowly. All right, let's talk about the L train. How long does it take an elevated train moving at normal speed to pass a given point? I don't know, 10 seconds? 12? Let's say 10, the architect said. Now, the woman testified that she saw the killing through the last 2 cars of the train. That means the train had been passing her window for at least 8 seconds before the body fell. The old man said he heard the boy shout and then a split second later heard the body hit the floor. But if the train was already passing when the boy shouted, the old man couldn't have heard anything, not with an L train roaring by 6 feet from his window. The room was quiet again, the kind of quiet that comes when people are thinking hard, when the certainty they'd felt just an hour ago is starting to crack like ice under the weight of too many questions. Number 3 stood up so violently his chair scraped against the floor like a scream. "I've had enough of this," he shouted. You're pulling tricks. You're confusing everybody with all this talk." "I'm not trying to confuse anyone. I'm trying to understand what really happened. We know what happened." Number 3's face was purple now, the veins standing out in his neck. "That little punk killed his father, and you're trying to let him get away with it." "Why?" the architect asked, his voice calm, infuriatingly calm. "Why would I want to do that?" Number 3 opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe you got a soft spot for these... He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone knew what he was going to say. Number 10, the garage owner, stood up. "I'll tell you what the problem is," his voice thick with cold and something uglier. "We're letting ourselves get confused by a bunch of pretty words when we all know what we're dealing with. These people, they're not like us. They don't think like us. They lie, they cheat, they're born killers." "Shut up," Number 5 said, his voice sharp as broken glass. Number 10 blinked at him. "What?" "I said, shut up." Number 5 was on his feet now, too, his hands clenched into fists. "I lived in a slum all my life. I played in backyards full of garbage. Maybe it still smells on me, I don't know. But I'm telling you, you don't know what you're talking about." "I didn't mean you," Number 10 said, backpedaling. "You're different. I meant..." "I know what you meant, and I'm telling you to shut your mouth." The architect stood up, moved between them, his hands out. "Gentlemen, please, this isn't helping." But it was helping in a way. The ugliness was out in the open now, the rot at the heart of the case exposed to the light. They weren't just talking about evidence anymore. They were talking about who they were, what they believed, what they were willing to do in the name of certainty. McCardle watched it all with his old man eyes, eyes that had seen too much of the world to be surprised by anything anymore. He'd known from the moment that first vote was taken that this wasn't going to be simple. Nothing ever was, not really. Not when you scratched the surface, not when you looked close enough to see the truth. The truth. That was the thing, wasn't it? The truth. Everyone in this room thought they knew it, thought they'd seen it clear as day during the trial. But the truth was slippery, elusive, like trying to hold water in your hands. It ran through your fingers no matter how tight you gripped it. Maybe the boy killed his father. Probably he had. The evidence said so. The witnesses said so. But maybe, just maybe, he hadn't. And that maybe, that tiny seed of doubt, was enough to make all the difference. "I want to change my vote," McCardle heard himself say. Everyone turned to look at him, the old man, Number 9, the one who'd been so quiet this whole time. "What?" the foreman said. "I'm changing my vote," McCardle repeated. His chest hurt, but he didn't reach for his pills. Not yet. "To not guilty." "Why?" Number 3 demanded. "Give me one good reason." He thought about it, thought about the old man who'd testified, thought about what it meant to be 75 years old and invisible, thought about how easy it would be to convince yourself you'd heard something, seen something, when the alternative was going back to being nobody. "Because," he said slowly, "this gentleman," he nodded at the architect, "has been standing alone against all of us. That's not easy. Takes courage, and I respect that. I want to hear more." The architect looked at him, and for just a moment their eyes met. There was understanding there, and something else. Gratitude, maybe. "The vote," the foreman said, his voice strained, "is now 10-2. Guilty." Outside, the heat pressed against the windows like something alive.
Inside, 12 men sat around a table and tried to decide if a boy they'd never really know deserved to live or die. And the doubt, that dangerous, beautiful doubt, continued to spread. The thing about being locked in a room with 11 other men, the architect thought, is that eventually all the masks come off. His name was Davis, Frank Davis, though like McCardle, none of them knew it yet. He was 42 years old, married with 3 kids at home in Westchester. He designed buildings for a living, which meant he spent his days thinking about structure, about foundations, about the importance of getting the small details right. A building that looked solid could collapse if the foundation was flawed. A case that looked open and shut could fall apart if you examined it closely enough. He'd known from the moment he walked into that courtroom that something was wrong. Not wrong in the sense that the evidence was faked or the witnesses were lying, though maybe they were, maybe they weren't, but wrong in the sense that everyone had already made their minds. The lawyers, the judge, the other jurors. Even the defendant's own attorney seemed to be going through the motions like a man who'd already accepted defeat. And maybe the boy killed his father. Davis wasn't naive. He'd seen enough of the world to know that people did terrible things, sometimes for reasons and sometimes for no reason at all. But he'd also seen enough of the world to know that certainty was dangerous, that the moment you stopped asking questions was the moment you stopped being human. So he voted not guilty, not because he was sure the boy was innocent, but because he wasn't sure he was guilty. And in America, in 1957, that was supposed to be enough. But Lord, it was getting hot in here. Number 3, a big man named Lee with a messenger service and a son he hadn't seen in 2 years, had taken off his jacket and was pacing the room like a caged animal. Every few minutes he'd stop and glare at Davis, his hands clenching and unclenching, and Davis knew what he was seeing. That was the thing about this case, Davis had realized. Everyone in this room was seeing something different when they looked at that boy. Number 10 saw every stereotype and prejudice he'd ever held. Number 5 saw himself, or the neighborhood he'd escaped from. And what did Davis see? A kid, just a kid, 19 years old, which seemed young until you remembered that 19-year-olds had stormed the beaches at Normandy just 13 years ago. Old enough to die for your country, old enough to die in an electric chair. Let's talk about the woman, number 4 said. He was the stockbroker. His name was something like Harrison or Henderson, and he had the kind of voice that made you think he was used to being listened to. She looked out her window and saw the killing. She was absolutely certain. Are we supposed to just ignore her testimony? No, Davis said, but we should examine it. She testified that she'd been tossing and turning in bed, unable to sleep. It was a hot night. Her bed was by the window. At 10 minutes after midnight, she looked out and saw the boy stab his father through the windows of a passing L train.
That's right, number 4 said. She saw it clearly, the last 2 cars of the train. Through the windows of a moving train, Davis said, at night, from 60 feet away. The prosecution demonstrated that it was possible, number 4 countered. They proved you could see through those windows. During the day, number 5 interjected. They proved it during the day in the courtroom, not at night, not from 60 feet away. Number 4 started to respond, but number 9, old McCardle, spoke up, his voice raspy but clear. There's something else, he said. Something I've been thinking about. Everyone turned to look at him. The woman, McCardle said, when she was testifying, she kept rubbing the sides of her nose, like this. He demonstrated, his gnarled fingers pressing against the bridge of his nose. She did it the whole time she was up there. So what? Number 7 asked. He was getting antsy, kept checking his watch, thinking about his ball game. Maybe her nose itched. But number 4 had gone very still. His hand had moved, unconsciously, to his own nose. She wore glasses, number 9 said. Not in court, but she wore them. You could see the marks they left, the indentations on the sides of her nose. I noticed because I've worn glasses all my life, and I know what those marks look like. You're making this all up, number 3 said. You're twisting everything. I'm asking questions, that's all. Isn't that what we're supposed to do? Number 7 stood up abruptly. I'm changing my vote, he announced. Not guilty. Let's just get this over with.
What? Number 3 whirled on him. You can't just... Why not? Number 7's face was flushed. I got a ball game to get to. We're going to be here all night at this rate. The guy made some good points. I got a reasonable doubt. That's all I need, right? Number 11, a watchmaker, a refugee from somewhere in Europe with an accent and a dignified way of speaking, stood up slowly. That is not a reason, not a good reason. You don't vote to save a man's life because you have tickets to a baseball game. Hey, who do you think you... Number 7 started. You sit here and play games with a man's life. You vote guilty because you want to leave, and now you vote not guilty because you want to leave. What kind of man are you? The 2 men stood there, glaring at each other across the table, and Davis could see the rest of them watching, uncertain which way this would go. Finally, Number 7 looked away. All right, he muttered. All right. I think there's reasonable doubt. Are you satisfied? Are you? Number 7 didn't answer.
But the vote had changed. Again, Number 5 had joined them too, convinced by the knife-fighting argument. 8-4. The tide was turning. Number 3 saw it too. Davis could see it in his face, the way his jaw clenched, the way his hands balled into fists. He was losing and he couldn't stand it. Let me tell you something about this kid, Number 3 said, his voice low and dangerous. You want to talk about reasonable doubt? Fine, let's talk about it. This kid, he's got a record as long as your arm. Fighting, stealing, stabbing someone when he was 15. You think a kid like that deserves the benefit of the doubt? Everyone deserves it, Davis said quietly. That's what the law says. The law, Number 3 spat. The law says a lot of things, but we know what we saw in that courtroom. We know what kind of kid this is. Do we? Asked Davis. We know what the prosecution told us. We know what the newspapers said. But do we really know him? Any of us? Number 3 took a step toward Davis, and for a moment Davis thought he was actually going to swing at him. But then Number 6, a house painter, stepped between them. That's enough, the painter said. His voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. You want to yell at somebody, yell at me, but you leave him alone. Number 3 stared at him, then at Davis, then at the rest of them. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving like he'd just run a mile. You people, he said finally, you make me sick. He turned and walked to the window, standing with his back to them all. McCardle watched this and thought about his own sons. He'd had 2 of them, though nobody here knew that. The older one had died a hero at Anzio. The younger one, well, that was a different story, a sadder story, the kind you didn't tell strangers in a jury room. But maybe he would tell it. Maybe before this day was through, he'd have to. Because looking at Number 3, seeing the rage and the pain and the loss there, McCardle understood something. This wasn't about the boy on trial. It had never been about the boy on trial. It was about their own sons, their own failures, their own guilt. And you couldn't send a kid to the chair because you were angry at your own son. That wasn't justice. That was just cruelty. The vote stood at 8-4. 4 men believing in reasonable doubt, 8 still certain of guilt. Number 4 looked troubled now, his usual composure cracking. He kept taking his glasses off, cleaning them, putting them back on. The argument about the L train timing had shaken him, Davis could see that. But he wasn't ready to change his vote, not yet. Number 10, on the other hand, was getting louder, more desperate. He could feel the tide turning against him, and it made him ugly. Look, he said, standing up and pacing the room. I don't know what's happening here, but we're losing sight of what's important. This kid, he's one of them. You know what I'm talking about. These people, they're not like us. A few of the jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They lie, Number 10 continued, his voice rising. It's born in them. They don't know what the truth is. And let me tell you, they don't need any real big reason to kill someone either. They get drunk, oh, they're very big drinkers, all of them, and bang, someone's lying in the gutter. Number 5 stood up quietly and walked to the coat rack, turning his back on Number 10. Nobody's blaming them for it, Number 10 went on, not noticing or caring. That's how they are, by nature. You know what I mean? Violent. Human life don't mean as much to them as it does to us. Number 9 got up slowly from his seat and walked to the window, standing with his back to Number 10.
"Where are you going?" number 10 demanded, but number 9 didn't answer. "Look, these people," number 10 continued, his voice getting desperate now. "They're lushing it up and fighting all the time, and if somebody gets killed, so somebody gets killed. They don't care. Oh sure, there are some good things about them too. I've known a couple who were okay, but that's the exception. You know what I mean?" Number 11 stood up and walked to the other window. "Most of them," number 10 said louder now, "it's like they have no feelings. They can do anything. What's going on here? I'm trying to tell you, you're making a big mistake, you people. This kid is a liar. I know it. I know all about them." Davis got up and walked to the wall, facing away from number 10. "Listen to me," number 10 shouted. "They're no good. There's not a one of them who's any good. We better watch out. This kid on trial here, his type, well, don't you know about them?" Number 2 stood and walked away, his back to number 10. Then number 6, then number 7, then number 12.
One by one, they turned their backs on him until number 10 stood alone in the middle of the room, his voice echoing off the walls, talking to no one. "Listen to me," he screamed. "Listen, there's a danger here. These people are wild. Don't you know about it?" Number 4 was the last to move. He stood slowly, looked at number 10 with something like pity, then turned his back as well. Even the foreman, mild-mannered, conflict-avoiding, even he turned away. Number 10 looked around wildly at the circle of backs, at the silent rejection. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I'm only trying to tell you." The room was absolutely silent. No one moved, no one spoke. They just stood there, their backs to him, and the weight of that silence was more powerful than any words could have been. Finally, number 4 turned around. He walked slowly back to the table, his face hard. "Sit down," he said quietly to number 10, "and don't open your mouth again." Number 10 sank into his chair, defeated. The others slowly returned to their seats, one by one, but something had changed. You could feel it in the air, like the charge before a lightning strike. The foreman cleared his throat. "I think," he said slowly, "we should vote again." "Now?" number 3 asked from the window, his voice tight. "Now," the foreman said. They voted by a show of hands. Davis watched as they went up, one by one. Number 5, number 9, number 11, Davis himself. And then, number 2 raised his hand, the meek bank clerk who'd spent the entire deliberation apologizing for breathing. His hand went up and stayed up. Number 6, the painter, solid, simple, honest. His hand went up too. Number 7, the salesman with the baseball tickets. He raised his hand without meeting anyone's eyes. And number 12, the advertising man who'd been drawing on his notepad all afternoon. He put down his pen and raised his hand. 8 hands in the air. The foreman looked around the table, counting silently. Then he looked down at his own hands, folded on the table in front of him, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he raised one. 9 for not guilty, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Davis felt something shift in his chest. They were close now, so close. "Who's voting guilty?" the foreman asked. 3 hands went up. Number 3, still standing at the window, number 4, sitting rigid in his chair, and number 10, slumped and broken but too stubborn to give up. "The vote," the foreman said, "is 9-3 in favor of acquittal." Number 3 turned from the window. "This is insane," he said, but there was less conviction in his voice now, more desperation. "You're letting yourselves be swayed by speeches and tricks and—" "It's not tricks," number 2 said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him, the little man who never spoke up, who always agreed with whoever spoke last, but his voice was firm now, certain. "I've been sitting here listening to everything, and I can't be sure anymore. I can't send a boy to die when I'm not sure." Number 6 nodded. "Me neither. Too many things don't add up." "It's not about what adds up," number 3 said. "It's about what we know, the evidence." "The evidence is questionable," number 7 interrupted. "All of it. The old man who couldn't have heard, the woman who couldn't have seen, the knife that isn't unique. What's left that we can be certain of? Nothing." Number 12 looked up from his notepad.
I kept trying to make it all fit together like pieces of a puzzle, but the pieces don't fit. They never did. Number 3 stared at them, his face going red. "You're all crazy, every one of you." "Maybe," Davis said quietly, "or maybe we're just honest about our doubt." Silence fell over the room again, heavy, oppressive. Then number 4 stood up. He walked to the center of the room, between the table and the windows, and he turned to face them all. "I want to talk about the woman, one more time." "We've talked about her," number 3 said wearily. "Not enough," number 4 said. He looked at McCardle. "You noticed something about her during the trial, marks on her nose."
McCardle nodded slowly. "From glasses. She wore glasses but didn't want anyone to know." Number 4 reached up and took off his own glasses. He held them in his hand, looking at them like he'd never seen them before. "I've worn glasses for 23 years, he said, every day, all day. Without them—" He looked up at the others, and his eyes were unfocused, struggling to see clearly. "Without them, I can barely see across this room, certainly not clearly enough to identify someone's face."
Davis felt something click in his mind, like a key turning in a lock. "She wasn't wearing glasses when she testified," he said slowly, "but she would have been wearing them at bed when she was trying to sleep." "Maybe," number 4 said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Or maybe not. People don't always wear their glasses to bed." "Exactly," Davis said. "She testified that she'd been tossing and turning, trying to sleep. Her glasses would have been on the nightstand, and when she looked out the window, when she saw the killing, she said it happened fast, just as she looked out. She wouldn't have had time to put them on." The room was silent. "So she saw a blur, a man, a boy, someone, but from 60 feet away, at night, through the windows of a moving train, without her glasses. How could she possibly identify who it was?" "She picked him out in court," number 3 insisted, but even he sounded less sure now. "He identified his voice." "His voice, yes," Davis agreed, "but that's different from seeing his face. And she said she saw him stab his father. She described the motion, overhand, down into the chest." He demonstrated, his arm raised. "The wrong way for a boy who'd been fighting with knives all his life." Number 4 said, "She saw something. I don't doubt that." He paused, putting his glasses back on. The world came back into focus. "But at that distance, in the dark, without her glasses, through the windows of a moving train, she couldn't have seen enough to identify anyone with certainty. She saw a shape, a blur, and she convinced herself it was the boy because that's what she expected to see." He looked around the table. "I'm convinced. There's reasonable doubt. I vote not guilty." Number 10 didn't even raise his head. He just sat there, slumped in his chair, defeated by his own ugliness, by the rejection he'd faced. "I'm done," he muttered. "Vote however you want. I don't care anymore." "You have to vote," Davis said gently. Number 10 looked up, his eyes empty and red. "Not guilty," he said, his voice barely audible. "There, not guilty." But he didn't sound like he believed it. He sounded like a man who'd lost everything that mattered. The foreman's voice cracked as he spoke. "The vote is 11-1 in favor of not guilty." Everyone turned to look at number 3. The rain started at 6:15. It came suddenly, the way summer storms do, the sky opening up like God had pulled a zipper. One moment the windows were showing the city baking in the heat, the buildings beyond turning into blurred shadows through the downpour. Number 3 stood at the window watching the rain, and something in his posture made Davis think of a man at a funeral, stiff, upright, holding himself together by force of will. The big man, the angry man. "I don't understand you people," he said, still staring out at the rain. "I truly don't. We've got witnesses, we've got evidence, we've got a kid with a record, and you're willing to let him walk?" "We're not letting him walk," Davis said gently. "We're saying we have a reasonable doubt." "Doubt," the man said, and the word sounded like a curse. "That's all this has been, doubt. What about certainty? What about the truth?" "What is the truth?" number 11 asked. The watchmaker, the refugee, the man who'd escaped God knows what horror to come to this country and now sat in judgment on it. Number 3 turned from the window. His face was wet, from the rain, Davis thought at first, but no, the window was closed. The wetness was tears.
"I'll tell you what happened," he said, his voice breaking. "A kid killed his father. That's what happened. Because kids do that now. They grow up rotten and mean, and they turn on you. They hit you. They hate you. He stopped, put his hand to his face. "My son," he said quietly. "When he was 9, I saw him run away from a fight. Another kid, bigger than him, and my boy just ran. I was so ashamed. So I told him I'd make a man out of him if it killed me. And I tried. God knows I tried. I hit him when he needed it. I was hard on him, because that's what fathers do. They make their boys strong." The room was silent, except for the rain. "And when he was 16, number 3 continued, we had a fight. I don't even remember what it was about. Something small, something stupid. And he hit me, right in the face, my own son. And then he walked out. That was 2 years ago. I haven't seen him since." He looked around the table, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "So yeah, maybe I see my son when I look at that kid. Maybe I do. But that doesn't mean he's innocent. That doesn't mean he didn't kill his father." "No," Davis said softly, "but it doesn't mean he did either."
McCardle stood up slowly, painfully, one hand pressed against his chest. His face was pale, beaded with sweat despite the rain cooling the air outside. But his voice, when it came, was stronger than Davis had heard it all day. "I want to tell you gentlemen something," McCardle said, "about my sons." Everyone turned to look at him. "I had 2 boys," McCardle continued. His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, to the place where his heart labored behind his ribs. "The older one, James Jr., he died at Anzio in 1944. A hero. I got a folded flag and a letter from his commanding officer telling me how brave he was, how he'd saved 3 men before he was killed." He paused, and Davis saw the old man's eyes grow distant, seeing something none of them could see. "I was proud of him," McCardle said, "so proud. But I'll tell you the truth. I loved my other son just as much, even though he gave me nothing to be proud of." His voice grew softer. "Thomas was 3 years younger than James. Where James was good, Thomas was wild. Where James studied, Thomas fought. Where James followed rules, Thomas broke them. He stole, he lied, he ran with a bad crowd. And I tried, Lord knows I tried, to straighten him out. I hit him, I yelled at him, I threw him out of the house twice, and twice I let him come back because he was my son and I loved him." McCardle looked down at his hands. "When he was 16, Thomas got into a fight. Over a girl, they said. Over nothing that mattered. He had a knife. The other boy had a knife. And when it was over, my Thomas was dead on a street corner 3 blocks from our home, and I wasn't there to save him." The room was absolutely silent. "That was in 1941, McCardle said, 3 years before James died. And I'll tell you something I've never told anyone. When the telegram came about James, when they told me my good son was dead, the first thing I felt was relief. Because at least James had died for something. At least his death meant something. Thomas just died. And I've spent 16 years wondering if there was something I could have done, something I should have said, some way I could have reached him before it was too late."
He looked up at number 3,
then at Davis, and his old eyes were clear and knowing. "You're both thinking about your sons," McCardle said quietly. "I can see it in your faces. You're seeing them when you look at that boy out there. And maybe that's not fair. Maybe that's not justice. But I'll tell you what I think." He paused, reaching into his jacket. For a moment, Davis thought he was reaching for his pills again. The old man had taken 2 during the deliberation, but instead he pulled out a small, creased photograph. He placed it gently on the table where they could all see it. A teenage boy, dark-haired, unsmiling, angry eyes that stared at the camera like it was an enemy. Thomas. "I look at that boy on trial," McCardle said, "and I see my Thomas. I see a kid who's been knocked around his whole life, who's made bad choices, who's probably going to make more bad choices, and maybe he killed his father. I don't know. None of us know." His hand pressed against his chest again, and Davis noticed how pale he'd become, how the sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the rain cooling the air outside. "But I know this," McCardle said. "If 12 men had been asked to show mercy to my Thomas, to give him a chance, to give him doubt when the evidence was against him, I would have wanted them to do it. Not because he deserved it, but because mercy is what you give to people who don't deserve it. That's what makes it mercy." He looked around the table, meeting each man's eyes. "So I'm asking you, not as a juror, as a father who lost a son and never got to save him, give this boy what nobody gave my Thomas. Give him reasonable doubt. Give him mercy. Give him a chance to be something other than what we think he is." The silence that followed was profound. Even the rain seemed to have quieted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Number 3 sat there, staring at the photograph on the table, at the angry, lost face of a boy who died 16 years ago. A boy who looked, Davis realized, remarkably like the defendant, like Number 3's own son, like Michael, like all the lost boys who'd ever lived and died and been forgotten. "I can't do this anymore," Number 3 said finally, and his voice was broken, empty. "I can't keep pretending this is about evidence, about facts, about what I know." He looked up at McCardle, and tears were streaming down his face. "I'm so angry at my son, so angry, and I've been taking it out on that kid out there. Because if he's guilty, if he's a monster, then maybe my son isn't. Maybe my son is just angry, just lost, just waiting for me to find him and bring him home." He put his head in his hands. "But that kid out there, he's somebody's son too. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we're all wrong. And maybe—" He couldn't finish, just sat there, shoulders shaking, while the other men looked away, giving him what privacy they could in this small, crowded room. Finally, he raised his head, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Not guilty," he said quietly. "I vote not guilty." The foreman cleared his throat. "The vote," he said, his voice unsteady, "is unanimous. Not guilty." They sat there for a moment, none of them quite believing it was over, that they'd done it, that 12 strangers had walked into this room certain of one thing and walked out believing another. "I'll inform the bailiff," the foreman said, standing. He walked to the door, knocked, handed the folded verdict to the guard. And just like that, it was over. The jurors began gathering their things. Jackets were shrugged on, ties were straightened. They moved like men waking from a dream, uncertain what to make of the world they'd just created. Number 3 was the last to stand. He walked to where McCardle sat, still holding that photograph of his dead son. "Thank you," Number 3 said quietly. McCardle looked up at him and smiled. It was a tired smile, the smile of a man who'd given everything and had nothing left to give. But it was genuine. "Go find your boy," McCardle said. "Don't wait. Don't let pride or anger keep him from you. Life's too short, and we lose him too easy." Number 3 nodded, unable to speak. Then he turned and walked out. Davis waited until the others had gone, until it was just him and McCardle in the empty room, with the rain still falling outside and the knife still stuck in the table where Number 3 had left it.
"You knew," Davis said quietly, "about my son." McArdle looked at him. I recognized the look, the guilt, the wondering, the need to save someone because you couldn't save the one that mattered. "Was it wrong?" Davis asked. "What we did? Was it wrong to vote based on our own pain instead of the evidence?" McArdle was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and gently picked up the photograph of Thomas, looked at it one last time before slipping it back into his pocket. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe. But I'll tell you what I do know. That boy out there, whether he's guilty or innocent, he's getting a second chance. And second chances are precious things. They're what my Thomas needed and never got, what your Michael needed and never got, what all our lost boys needed." He stood slowly, painfully, one hand pressed against his chest. "Maybe we're wrong," he said. "Maybe that boy walks out of here and does something terrible tomorrow. But maybe he doesn't. Maybe he becomes something better. And that maybe, that tiny possibility, I think that's worth the doubt." They walked together, down the courthouse steps and into the rain. The other jurors had already dispersed, vanishing into the city like they'd never existed. Strangers brought together for one afternoon, for one purpose, and then scattered again to their separate lives. At the bottom of the steps, McArdle paused. "I think I'll rest here a moment," he said, lowering himself onto the wet concrete. "My chest is bothering me. Just need to catch my breath." Davis sat down beside him. They sat there together in the rain, two old men who'd lost their sons and tried to save someone else's. "We did right," McArdle said after a moment, "didn't we?" Davis thought about it, about the evidence, about the witnesses, about all the reasons they should have voted guilty, about the boy, whoever he was, whatever he'd done, about mercy and justice and the impossible space between them. "Yes," he said finally, "I think we did." McArdle smiled, tilted his face up to the rain. He closed his eyes. "Good," he said. "That's good." They sat there as the rain fell and the city moved around them, and somewhere in a courthouse above them, a 19-year-old boy learned that 12 strangers had chosen to believe in the possibility of his innocence. And when Davis finally stood up, ready to go home to his wife and his living children and whatever remained of his life, McArdle didn't get up with him. "Mr. McArdle?" Davis said. But McArdle was still sitting there, his face peaceful, tilted up to the rain, and Davis knew, even before he checked for a pulse, even before he ran back up the courthouse steps shouting for help, that the old man was gone. He'd given his last bit of strength to save a boy he didn't know, had spent his last words asking for mercy, had died knowing they'd done right. There were worse ways to go, Davis thought, as he held the old man's hand and waited for help to arrive. Much worse ways.
The ambulance arrived 7 minutes later, but there was nothing they could do. McArdle was gone. Davis stood in the rain and watched as they loaded the old man's body onto a stretcher, watched as they covered him with a white sheet that turned gray in the downpour. One of the paramedics asked if he was family, and Davis almost said no, almost said they'd just been strangers thrown together for an afternoon. But that wasn't true anymore. "Yes," Davis said, "he was my friend." The paramedic nodded and made a note on his clipboard. Then the ambulance pulled away, its lights flashing red against the wet pavement, and Davis was alone on the courthouse steps. He stood there for a long time, rain soaking through his jacket, running down his face like tears. Above him, in one of those courthouse windows, a 19-year-old boy was learning that he was free, that 12 strangers had chosen to believe in the possibility of his innocence, that he had a second chance. Davis hoped the boy would use it well, hoped McArdle's last act hadn't been wasted. But he'd never know, and maybe that was okay. Maybe not knowing, living with the doubt, carrying the uncertainty, was the price you paid for choosing mercy.
The rain began to let up. The storm was passing, the way storms always did. Soon the sun would break through and the city would steam in the heat, and people would go about their lives like nothing had happened. But something had happened. In a small, hot room on the second floor of this courthouse, 12 strangers had wrestled with truth and doubt and justice, had faced their own prejudices, their own pain, their own ghosts, and they'd chosen, impossibly, improbably, to give mercy to someone who might not have deserved it. That would matter. Somehow, somewhere, it would matter. Davis pulled McArdle's photograph from his pocket, the one of Thomas, the angry teenage boy who died too young. The rain had spotted it, making the image blur. Davis looked at it one last time, then carefully folded it and put it in his wallet next to the photograph of Michael. 2 lost boys, 2 fathers who couldn't save them. But maybe they'd saved one today. He turned and walked down the courthouse steps, into the rain-washed city, toward home, toward his wife and his living children and whatever remained of his life. Behind him, the courthouse stood solid and gray and imposing, full of its own secrets and sorrows. And in a room on the second floor, a knife still quivered in a scarred table, marking the spot where 12 angry men had learned that certainty was an illusion, and that doubt, beautiful, terrible, necessary doubt, was the only honest answer any of us ever had. Davis walked until he couldn't see the courthouse anymore, and then he kept walking, carrying the weight of what they'd done, what they'd chosen, what they'd given, carrying it alone, the way we all carry the things that matter most, but carrying it forward, always forward.